If you're working in a Spring application and you need to send something to a public API, or you're working in a distributed architecture and you need to send data from one microservice to another, how do you do it? That's the question we'll answer today. My name is Dan Vega, and I'm a Spring Developer Advocate for VMware. If you sign up for my newsletter on danvega.dev, I send you a welcome email, and in that email, I ask the question, if you're struggling learning anything, please go ahead and ask those questions, and I'll see if I can create some content around that. Well, I got an email from Delvin in Indonesia, and he sent me a really nice email. I won't go through the entire thing, but I will summarize it here. I'm struggling to create a project that can do the following: get data from a third-party API, save it into a database, and then send that data to a third-party API or another microservice in my distributed architecture. So that is the project that we're going to build today. As always, you will find all the resources along with the GitHub repository in the description below. With that, let's start writing some code. We're going to get started with today's tutorial, as we do with every Spring project, by heading over to start.spring.io. I'm going to create two different services today: a to-do service, which is going to call out to a public API and pull down 200 different to-dos. We're going to persist those off to a database, and then we'll create another service called the dashboard service, which is going to allow us to push from the to-do service to the dashboard service. These are going to look pretty similar, so we're going to go ahead and add in our dependencies here. This is going to take in Spring Web. It's also going to have Spring Data JDBC. I like JDBC, just kind of simplifies some things. And we'll also need a database. I'm going to use an in-memory database. H2 is a really good fit here. So I'm going to change the group to dev.danvega. As I said, we're going to have a to-do service. Everything on the defaults looks good. I'll go ahead and generate that project. And then when that's done, I'm just going to change the artifact to dashboard service and go ahead and generate that project. And let's go ahead and open up both of those in IntelliJ. All right, so I have both projects open in IntelliJ. I have my dashboard service and I have my to-do service. Now I could work on these as separate different projects, so I can have two different windows open and just kind of switch between windows as I like. But I don't want to do that. This is a single project for me. I'm basically working on my dashboard service and I'm pulling in my to-do service. So what I want to do is kind of combine those into one project. I'm going to go ahead and close the to-do service. We'll go ahead and maximize this. I'm going to go up to File, and I'm going to create a new project or a new module from existing sources. So I'm going to go into my downloads, and where my to-do service is, I'm going to go ahead and pick that to-do service. So it will create a new service in here, and now I have a dashboard service and a to-do service. One thing I like to do, if you have multiple projects open in IntelliJ and you're using the Ultimate Edition, you should have this Services tab down here. So if I go into my Services tab, I should be able to go ahead and open up, let's see, our main application class, and let's go ahead and run this. And so as I run that, and then as I go into my to-do service here and I run that, so we're actually not going to be able to run this, but it should pick up the, oh yeah, hey, you're using multiple services here. Do you want to use services? Yes, I do. So I'm going to go ahead and select use services. And now I have two services in here. They won't both start up right now because they're both on port 8080 and you can't start them both on port 8080. But now I have everything in one window. I don't need to go in and start one and start the other. So this is a really good place to be. So the first thing that we need to do is I want to start in the to-do service. So in the to-do service, I need to create a representation of a to-do, a model. So one thing I want to do is head back to the browser real quick and take a look at JSON placeholder. This is the public API that we're going to use to consume some to-dos from. So it's nice because it's public. You don't need to be authenticated to use it. And if you go down here, there's a URL for to-dos. So JSON placeholder.typecode.com/to-dos, and then you get 200 to-dos. So a to-do has an ID, a user ID, a title, and completed. And we are going to mimic that in our Java project here. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new package. I'm going to go ahead and call this model. In this model, I'm going to create a new Java class. We're going to call it to-do. Because we're using Spring Data JDBC, I can go ahead and use a record type. And so this record is going to have an @ID. The integer, the ID is going to be of type integer. We're going to have another integer for user ID. We're going to have a title, and we're going to have a Boolean for completed. And we'll come back to it. We're actually going to probably need something else here, but let's start with that. So now that we have that, we'll want to go ahead and create a new package for repository. In the repository, I'm going to create a new Java class, and we'll call this the to-do repository. And we'll go ahead and create that as an interface. This is going to extend the CRUD repository. So it takes in a type. The type is going to be to-do. The ID is of type integer. And that should give us everything we need. So now we get some CRUD functionality out of the box. We are starting to get closer to having a to-do application. Now, when we persist items off to the database, it's going to have these different columns in the database. So we actually need to create a schema that represents that table. So I'm going to create a new file in here. I'm going to go ahead and call this schema.sql. That is by convention. And again, we can do some things in here. The first thing I want to do is actually just create a new table, and we'll call this to do. And inside of this table, we're going to create those columns. So I'm going to say in ID int, we'll say not null, user ID int not null. We'll also say title, varchar, we'll say 100, completed, which is a Boolean, and finally, let's just leave it at that for now. So that looks good. So far, so good. The final thing that I want to do before we can just check out to see if everything is working is open application.properties. So I want to set a data source name. We'll call this to-dos. I don't want to generate a unique name for that data source. And by default, I want to go ahead and enable the H2 console so I can see what's going on in my database. So with that, I think we can go ahead and try and start our to-do service. So let's go ahead and run our to-do service and see if that starts up. And it does. Let's go ahead and take a look at the database here. So we'll go to H2 console. We will go ahead and log into to-dos, connect, and we do see a to-do table, and there are no records in it, which is exactly what I would expect at this point. All right, the next thing I want to do is I want to come in and create a new package in here. We'll go ahead and call this service. And inside of this service package, I'm going to create a new class, and we'll call this JSON placeholder service. We're going to go ahead and mark this with the @service annotation, so Spring knows to go ahead and create an instance of it for us. And what this is going to do is this is going to be a class that is going to reach out to that public API, get those 200 to-dos, and then we can use that elsewhere to go ahead and persist them off to the database. So the first thing I need is a URL for that to-do API. So I'm going to say private final string to-do API URL, and that is at JSON placeholder.typecode.com/to-dos. So now I would probably externalize this in some configuration somewhere, but for now this is okay. So next thing I need is a way to go ahead and call out to this service. So I could say, hey, I'm going to get back a list of to-do, and I'm going to say this is going to be called get to-dos. And so now I need a way to call out and get those to-dos. So there are a bunch of different ways that you can do this in a Spring application or a Java application in general. So you can use some of the lower level libraries to go ahead and do this. In Java, as long as you're on Java 11 or later, there's the HTTP client that you can use. In Spring, there's a few different ways that you can tackle this. There is a REST template, which is traditionally used in blocking applications like the one we're working on, which is Spring MVC. If you're using non-blocking, something like Spring Web Flux, there is a web client that is non-blocking. And in Spring Boot 3.0 going forward, we have these things called declarative HTTP clients. So I'm going to use a REST template today because there's nothing wrong with that. We are in a blocking environment. I have no problem using REST template. I need an instance of REST template to go ahead and use in my different applications. So one thing I'm going to do is come in here so I don't have to like constantly create new instances of REST template. I'm going to create a bean and we'll go ahead and say this is going to return a REST template. And all we're going to do is return new REST template. We could configure this if we wanted to. I don't need to configure that any further. So I'm going to say private final REST template. REST template. We're going to get that through constructor injection. And now that that bean was created in the main application class, Spring will know to go ahead and wire that up for me. So what I can do now in here is say, I want to use that REST template. We're going to run the exchange method, and I'm going to call the to-do API URL. This is going to be a get. So I'm going to say HTTP method get. And I'm not going to pass a request entity, so I can say that's null. This is where it gets a little bit tricky. This is where people always get confused. What is this return type? You can't just say this is a list of to-dos. Well, if you want to, we can go in depth in this in another tutorial, just the way that Jackson does its decode or marshalling or deserialization. The way that we need to do this is we just need to use a new parameter type reference, and this is going to be a list of to-dos. So if you do that, everything should be good. And we're going to close that off, and we'll introduce a new local variable here, and we'll just call that exchange. That's fine. And what I want to do now is just return whatever we get back from that exchange, the body. So that is going to be the list of to-dos. So this is looking good. Everything we need in our JSON placeholder service looks good. Let's head back over to our main application class, and I think we can get pretty close to doing something here. So what I want to do when the application starts, I want to go ahead and call that JSON placeholder service, get a list of to-dos, and then persist them off to our database. To do that, I'm going to use a command line runner. Command line runner is just this nice little functional interface that we can use that will go ahead and run after the application context has been created and right before the application is started up. So we can go ahead and do this by creating a bean here in our main application class. You can also create a class that implements that interface. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and say return args. And we'll close that off. And so what I want to do is when the application loads, get the 200 to-dos from JSON placeholder. So the way that we're going to do that is we need an instance of that service. So I'm going to say JSON placeholder service placeholder. Let's call it JSON placeholder service. So I'll say JSON placeholder service that get to-dos, and we'll create a local variable, and that is a list of to-dos called to-dos. So that should give us everything we need there. I also want to go ahead and do some logging. So I created this little live template. I've done another video on this. If you want to watch it, just makes it easier for me to add this logging statement to my class. So now I have an instance of a logger. I can go ahead and say log.info. And what I want to log is I just want to say saved to-dos in the database. I just want to make sure we are getting those 200. So I'll say to-dos.size. Okay, looks good. And then finally, what I want to do is when we are done, let's see. Once we have the to-dos, persist them to the DB. Okay, so now the way that we're going to do this is we need one more service in here, right? We need that repository. So I have a to-do repository, and we'll just call this repository. And that repository has all the CRUD methods on it that we need to, create, read, update, delete, list all, etc. So what we can do is we can use that repository and we can say save. We could iterate over them and then save them one by one, but there's a handy little save all method that allows us to pass in an iterable of entities. And guess what? To-dos, our list of to-dos will satisfy that requirement, so we can go ahead and pass that in. So now what we should do is go ahead and run this application. If there are no errors, this will run when the application starts. We will get our instances injected into this method for us, and then we can go ahead and say, go ahead and get all the to-dos from JSON placeholder, log that happened, and then save those off to the database. So let's go ahead and actually move this up. I want to say those are saved in the database after we actually save them in the database. So let's go back to our services panel. Let's go ahead and rerun to-do service. And nope, we got an error. This is the fun stuff. Okay, let's see what's going on here. Failed to execute command line runner. Failed to update entity. Okay, so here's what's going on here. Failed to update entity. So this is a byproduct of using Spring Data JDBC. Because we have passed in an ID, because we're getting the IDs from the to-do from JSON placeholder. Every one of those to-dos already has an ID. And because it already has an ID, Spring Data JDBC thinks that you're trying to update an existing to-do, which we are not. We're trying to create a new one. I'll go ahead and link to an article. There are a couple ways around this. One of the easiest ways is to come into to-do, and I want to say this is going to be, what do we want? This is going to be a version, right? So we want to call this, this is going to be of type integer. We'll call this version, and we'll go ahead and mark this with @version from org.springframework.data.annotation. So let's go ahead and save that. We'll need that version column in our database. So we'll say that is called version, and it's an int, and that should be everything that we need. So now with that ID and the version, so the version will get started at 0, it knows that it's a new record and it's not something that we are trying to update. So let's go ahead and try to rerun this and see if that fixes our issue, and it does. So let's head back over to the browser. I'm going to go ahead and refresh this. We're going into to-dos. And if I look at the to-do table now, there is 200 records. So we have all of our records in here. We can see that we have the ID, user ID, title, completed, and then this version gets started at 0, and that's how it knows that it's a new record being inserted and not something that's being updated. So that is our to-do service. I think that's really all we need to do here. We'll have to come back to this in a minute, because what we want to do is once this happens, we want to go ahead and push this information to our dashboard service. So again, we're going to talk about how can we do that? How can we go ahead and send information using something like REST template? How can we consume that information over in our dashboard service? So before we do that, let's head over and work on the dashboard service. All right, so I'm going to move over into the dashboard service, and we are going to, with any distributed architecture in a microservice world that we live in, we're going to repeat ourselves a little bit. And for this dashboard service, we're going to have to replicate our to-do model, the schema that we use. So there's going to be a little bit of code duplication, but that's okay. So I'm going to create a new package here. I'm going to call this model. In this model, I'm going to create a new class. I'm going to call this to-do, and this is going to be a type record. And again, we're just going to paste in what we used before so that it looks exactly the same as the one in our to-do service. Now, also from our to-do service, I'm going to go over to source main resources and copy this schema.sql, and we're going to copy that into a new file here. So I'm going to call that again schema.sql. We'll paste that in. Let's go ahead and make that look a little prettier. And we'll save. And okay, so that gives us everything we need. Actually, we need a repository too. So let's create a new package. We'll call this repository. And inside of there, I'll create a new repository called to-do repository. And this is, of course, an interface that extends CRUD repository, takes in a type of to-do, and then the ID type is integer, and that gives us everything we need there. So next up, remember we tried to start this application alongside the other one at the beginning, and they both can't run on port 8080, so we need to set a port here. So I'm going to go ahead and set a port of 8081, so that will let us start this on a different port. And actually, while I'm in there, let's go ahead and set up those same properties we did before. So we're going to set a data source name. I'm going to call this one dashboard. And we need to generate a unique name as false. And I want to enable the H2 console. So those are the settings we need. So we have our model, we have our repository. What we need to do now is we need to create a controller. And the controller is going to be a place where we can consume the information that is being sent to us from the to-do service. So let's go ahead and create a new controller. We'll call this dashboard controller. This is going to this is going to be a REST controller, and we'll set a request mapping of /API/dashboard. And then what we need in here is we'll need a couple things. So first we'll need that repository. So private final to do repository. We'll call this repository, and we'll get this through constructor injection. And then what we need is a method. So we'll call this load to-dos. So this is going to take in a list of to-dos, and this is going to be via post mapping. And the way that we're going to do this is we're going to get this in the request body. So list of to-dos, and then we'll call this to-dos. And basically we're just going to use our repository and save all of these in the database. So that should be, I think, it from the dashboard service. And then what we'll do is let's go back to our services. I'm going to start the dashboard service. Hopefully this runs on 8081 now. Okay, and indeed that has started up on 8081. So we have both our applications here, but we need to go back to the to-do service and make one more change, right? We need a way to push the information that we got to our new dashboard service. So here, in our application, our main application class, we get a list of to-dos, we save them in the database, and now how can I push these over to our dashboard service? All right, so here in our services, I'm going to create a new service class. Let's call this to-do service. Again, I could probably just do this right in the main application class, but this seems like some business logic that should be encapsulated in its own to-do service. Again, that way it makes it easier to test, single responsibility, all of the right things we should be doing here. So let's make a service class. We are going to need a few things in here, right? One of which, let me get a logger. So I have a logger in here. The next thing I'm going to need is an API URL for that dashboard service. So let's say dashboard API URL is equal to, and remember this is going to run on 8081. We set that up as an API/dashboard/ let's just double check what we called it there. So if we go into main Java controller, and then let's just show a quick tip here. I could have easily did the open. Let me open a class called dashboard controller. That was much easier than having to scrub through all of those folders. So we set a post mapping, but we did not set a post mapping. We don't want it at just API dashboard, right? So we should probably set this at /todos. So if I do that and then restart my dashboard service, make sure it runs. Okay, So now in my to-do service, that is going to go to to-dos, right? Okay, so far so good. What I also need in here is a to-do repository because we're going to get a list of to-dos. So private final to-do repository. Call this repository. And we'll get this via constructor injection. And then we'll need a method to send to dashboard. And so this is going to take in a list of to-dos. So we'll call this to-dos. And then, so I guess we don't need this to get a list of to-dos if we're going to accept the list of to-dos. So let me just get rid of that. We don't need that. We don't need that. Let's get rid of that. Okay, so again, this comes back to kind of the whole point of this tutorial, right? I have a service. I need to send information to another service. How do I do that? So we use the REST template to get information from one service and then save it into a database. We can use the REST template to do a whole bunch of things. So let's get an instance of that REST template that we already have created. So we'll say REST template. Let's add that. And again, we are covering just a couple methods available to us in this REST template. There are a whole bunch of things that you can do in here. So I would go ahead and look through this class and look at all the things you can do, like get for object, post for object, which we're going to look, put, patch, delete, exchange, a whole bunch of things going on in here that makes communicating with another API possible and less lower level. So we get all these really nice methods and overloaded methods for different situations. So what I want to do here is I want to use the REST template, and I want to say I want to go ahead and post for an entity. So we're going to post to a URL, which is that dashboard API URL. We are going to send the list of to-dos that we get in this method as the request body. And oh yeah, the response type is I just want to get a string back. So I'm actually not getting anything right now, but that's okay. We could send a string, a Boolean, something back, but we're not going to at this moment. So now I want to say is if the response, oh wait, we need to set this to, let's say, a response. If response.get status code is, we'll just say successful, go ahead and log.info to-dos sent to dashboard successfully. Whoops. All right. So I think that is everything. Now, if we go back to the main to-do application, how do we do that? We need to get that service in here. So to-do service. And again, I would probably refactor this. Looking at this, I would probably create a separate class for the command line runner and just have it implement the command line runner there. But this works fine for this example. So now I have this service, and I want to go ahead and send to dashboard. And I already have my list of to-dos here, so I'll pass that in as an argument. And now when this application loads, it should go ahead and reach out to the JSON placeholder service, which will call this public API and using the REST template, get a list of those to-dos and marshal those into a list of to-dos. So we return that body, and then we're going to go ahead and use our repository to persist those to the database. We log some information about that, and then we'll go ahead and push these off to the dashboard. And again, we're using REST template here to go ahead and post for entity. So now it's sending a post request with the to-dos as the request body. And then if we look at our dashboard controller, this is accepting a post mapping. So a post request here to load to-dos. It's accepting the list of to-dos and the request body. and then it's just going to go ahead and save those off. So we're going to run these, and then we should be able to go into the dashboard database and see those 200 there as well. So again, I'm going to close these out. I want to go down to services. My dashboard's already running. I'm going to rerun my to-do service to see if that works. And it looks like it did. Let's look at our logs here. So we saved 200s in the database. We also sent them to the dashboard successfully. So what I want to do now is go over to localhost 8080/h2 console. And actually, I want to go to 8081. And we want to take a look at the dashboard. And if we go ahead and select that, there we go. We have our 200 to-dos. So pretty cool stuff. We have two applications here. We're just kind of working on both applications as separate services. And we were able to load the to-dos from a public API in our to-do service, persist them to a database, then send them off to another service using the REST template. And again, consuming those in our dashboard application and persisting those into a separate database. I really hope you enjoyed that tutorial, friends. And as always, if you found value in this video, do me a favor, leave me a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button. And as always, friends, happy coding.